The cold barrel of a revolver pressed against Bethany Davis's temple as her father's trembling voice sealed her fate. "You'll marry Wilcox tomorrow, or I'll put a bullet in your head myself." It wasn't the wedding threat that shocked her. It was the desperate fear in her father's eyes that told her he meant every word. Colorado Territory, 1875, was no place for mercy when debts came due. Bethany stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror of her bedroom at the Davis family ranch outside Kingfisher, Colorado. Her blonde hair was pinned up in an elaborate style that felt foreign to her practical nature, and the wedding dress her mother had rushed to finish hung loose on her frame. She'd lost weight since her father announced he'd settled his gambling debts by promising her hand to Harold Wilcox, the wealthiest and most despised man in the territory. "It's time, Bethany," her mother said softly from the doorway, her eyes red-rimmed from crying all night. "The wagon is waiting." "How could he do this to me?" Bethany whispered, clutching the simple pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. "I'm his daughter, not livestock to be traded." Her mother's shoulders slumped with the weight of 20 years of disappointment. "Your father owes Wilcox more money than we could earn in 3 lifetimes. When Wilcox saw you in town last month, he made an offer. It was this or lose everything." "Including my soul," Bethany said, straightening her back. At 20 years old, she had always known her future would involve marriage, but she'd foolishly hoped for love, for choice. The journey to the small white church on the edge of town felt like a funeral procession. Bethany sat rigid between her parents, watching the familiar landscape of rolling plains and distant mountains pass by for what might be the last time. Harold Wilcox lived on the other side of the territory, far from everyone she'd ever known. "You'll learn to be happy," her father muttered, not meeting her eyes. "Wilcox has promised you'll want for nothing." "Except my freedom," she replied coldly. The church loomed ahead, its white steeple piercing the cloudless blue sky. Several expensive carriages were already parked outside Wilcox's business associates, come to witness his latest acquisition. At 53, Harold Wilcox had buried 2 wives already. Town gossip suggested neither death had been entirely natural. Her father helped her down from the wagon, his grip painfully tight on her arm. "Don't embarrass me, girl," he hissed. "Remember what's at stake." Inside, the church was stifling hot, decorated with flowers that already wilted in the summer heat. Harold Wilcox stood at the altar, his silver hair slicked back, expensive suit straining against his substantial belly. His eyes, small and calculating, traveled over her body with the same assessment he might give a prize mare. The ceremony was a blur. Bethany heard herself speak the words without feeling them, felt the heavy gold ring slide onto her finger without resistance. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Wilcox's kiss tasted of cigars and whiskey, making her stomach turn. "Mrs. Wilcox," he said afterward, gripping her elbow as they exited the church, "you've made me a very happy man today. I expect you'll be an obedient wife." The reception was held at Kingfisher's only hotel, where Wilcox had reserved the entire dining room. Bethany sat beside him, hardly touching the elaborate meal, watching as he drank steadily and laughed too loudly with his friends. "We leave at first light tomorrow," he told her between gulps of expensive bourbon. "My business in Silver Creek can't wait any longer." Silver Creek was nearly 2 days' hard ride from Kingfisher, farther from her family than she had ever been. Bethany nodded mutely, watching her parents across the room. Her mother dabbed at her eyes while her father pocketed an envelope Wilcox had discreetly passed him earlier. That night, in a hotel room that smelled of furniture polish and old cigars, Bethany endured her wedding night with silent tears, and her face turned toward the wall. Wilcox snored heavily afterward, one meaty arm flung possessively across her waist. In the darkness, Bethany made a silent vow. This would not be her life forever. Somehow, someday, she would escape. Morning came too quickly. Wilcox had arranged for a private coach to take them to Silver Creek, with 2 armed men riding alongside protection. He claimed, though Bethany wondered if they were actually there to ensure she didn't flee. "You'll find Silver Creek quite civilized," Wilcox said as they left Kingfisher behind, seemingly oblivious to her misery. "My house is the finest in town, 3 stories with real glass windows imported from back east. The ladies of the town will be eager to meet you, though I expect you to be selective with your friendships. As my wife, you have a certain position to maintain." Bethany barely heard him, watching through the window as the landscape changed from the familiar plains to more rugged territory. They stopped only briefly to change horses and take meals at roadside stations. Wilcox kept her close, his hand always at her elbow or the small of her back, a gesture that might have seemed protective to observers, but felt like a shackle to Bethany. By late afternoon of the second day, Bethany was exhausted, every bone aching from the jarring journey over rough roads. They had entered a narrow mountain pass when the first gunshot cracked through the air. "Bandits!" shouted one of their escorts. "Mr. Wilcox, get down!" The coach lurched violently as the driver whipped the horses to a gallop. Wilcox pulled Bethany to the floor of the coach, his heavy body nearly crushing her. More shots rang out, and she heard a man scream, one of their guards, she realized. "If they recognize me, we're dead," Wilcox muttered, his face pale with fear. "I've dealt with these mountain gangs before. They'd ransom you and kill me for certain." The coach suddenly pitched sideways, throwing them against the wall as one wheel caught a rock and shattered. Bethany's head struck the window frame, and for a moment, stars exploded behind her eyes. When her vision cleared, the coach was tipped on its side, and Wilcox was sprawled unconscious beside her, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. Outside, she could hear men shouting and horses snorting. Gunfire had ceased. Carefully, Bethany pushed herself up and peered through the broken window. Their remaining escort was lying motionless in the dirt, and the driver was nowhere to be seen. 5 men on horseback surrounded the coach, bandanas pulled up over their faces. "Check inside." One of them called, his voice muffled by the cloth covering his mouth. Bethany shrank back as footsteps approached. The door above her was wrenched open, and a man's face appeared, blue eyes startlingly bright against the dusty bandana. "There's a woman and a man," he called to his companions. "Man looks hurt." "Wilcox?" someone asked sharply. "Yeah, it's him all right. Perfect. Get them both out." Rough hands reached down, and Bethany found herself being pulled from the wreckage. She stumbled as her feet hit the ground, her wedding dress torn and dirty, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. "Please," she said, finding her voice at last. "I have nothing of value." The man who had pulled her from the coach stared at her with those piercing blue eyes. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair visible beneath a worn brown hat. For a moment, something flickered in his gaze, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "You're Wilcox's wife?" he asked. Before she could answer, Wilcox was dragged from the coach, regaining consciousness and sputtering with rage. "You'll hang for this. Do you know who I am?" "We know exactly who you are," said the leader, dismounting from his horse. He pulled down his bandana, revealing a face weathered by sun and hardship, with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw. "Harold Wilcox, the man who's been cheating honest miners out of their claims and foreclosing on half the farms in the territory." Wilcox's face purpled. "This is robbery." "Take my money, but—" "Shut up," the leader snapped. He turned to Bethany. You're really married to this snake, she lifted her chin. As of yesterday. The blue-eyed man who'd pulled her from the coach exchanged a look with the leader. She's not part of this, Caleb. We can't just leave her here, the leader Caleb replied. And we certainly can't let her go back to town to identify us. I'll take responsibility for her, the blue-eyed man said firmly. Caleb shrugged. Your choice, Xavier, but if she causes trouble, it's on your head. He turned back to Wilcox, who was now being held between two of the other men. Harold Wilcox, you've been sentenced by the people you've wronged. Your mines that you stole through false papers, your money taken from honest folk, it all ends today. You're nothing but common thieves. Wilcox spat, struggling against his captors. No, Caleb said coldly. We're the reckoning you've had coming for years. Bethany watched, frozen, as they dragged Wilcox toward his horse. They bound his hands and secured him to the saddle. What are you doing with him? She asked, finding her voice. Taking him to face those he's wronged, Caleb answered. There's a whole camp of miners who lost everything to him. They'll decide his fate. He looked at Xavier. Take the woman to the cabin. We'll meet you there after we're done. Xavier nodded, then approached Bethany. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 25 or 26, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the hard set of his jaw and the wariness in his eyes. I won't hurt you, he said quietly, pulling down his bandana. But you need to come with me now. And if I refuse? Bethany asked, though she knew she had little choice. They were miles from anywhere the coach destroyed, their escorts dead or fled. Then you'll be alone in mountain country with night coming on, he replied matter-of-factly. There are wolves and bears, and the temperature drops below freezing after dark. Your choice. Her choice. As if she had one. Xavier Reeves watched the woman consider her options, her green eyes taking in the ruined coach, the empty road, the approaching dusk. She was beautiful, even disheveled and frightened, with a quiet dignity that surprised him. Most women would be hysterical after surviving a coach robbery and seeing their husband taken away. I'll go with you, she said finally, her voice steady. But I want to know where you're taking me and what's going to happen to my husband. Xavier hesitated. He couldn't tell her everything, not yet. I'm taking you to a safe place until we figure out what to do. As for Wilcox, that depends on him. He led her to his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding with a white blaze down its face. Can you ride? Yes, she answered, but not in this dress. Xavier studied the elaborate wedding gown, now torn and dirty from the crash. Without a word, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a spare shirt and trousers. These will be too big, but they'll work better than that dress. You can change behind those rocks, he said, pointing to a small outcropping nearby. I won't look. Bethany took the clothes with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. The idea of wearing men's clothing was shocking, but practicality won out. She disappeared behind the rocks, and Xavier busied himself gathering supplies from the wrecked coach, deliberately keeping his back turned. When she emerged, the transformation was striking. She'd torn strips from her petticoat to bind the trousers at her waist and ankles, and with her hair falling in golden waves around her shoulders, she looked like something from a dream, part lady, part outlaw. Better? He asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Yes. She approached cautiously. Where are the others taking my husband? There's a camp about 10 miles west of here. Miners and farmers who lost their land when Wilcox called in loans no one could repay. He helped her mount the horse, then swung up behind her. Hold on to the saddle horn. They rode in silence as the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Xavier was acutely aware of the woman seated before him, her back rigid, maintaining as much distance between them as the saddle allowed. the scent of her hair somehow still carrying the faint trace of lavender despite the day's events was distracting. "What's your name?" he asked finally, guiding the horse up a narrow trail that switchbacked along the mountainside. She hesitated before answering. "Bethany. Bethany Davis." "Wilcox, I suppose, though I've hardly had time to get used to it." "How long have you known him?" Xavier kept his tone conversational, though his interest was more than casual. "Barely at all," she replied after a moment. "It was an arranged marriage. My father owed him money." Xavier's hands tightened on the reins. "So he bought you?" "More or less," she said quietly. "My father didn't give me much choice." The bitterness in her voice made him want to turn the horse around and join Caleb in confronting Wilcox, but he had his orders. And besides, the woman Bethany was his responsibility now. "The cabin's just ahead," he said as they rounded a bend in the trail. "It's not much, but it's dry and warm." The cabin was nestled in a small clearing, built of sturdy logs with a stone chimney. It was simple but well maintained, with a small corral for horses and a woodpile stacked neatly against one wall. Xavier helped Bethany dismount, noting how she winced slightly. "Are you hurt?" he asked, concern overriding his usual caution. "Just bruised from the crash," she said, straightening with obvious discomfort. "Nothing serious." Xavier nodded, unsure how to proceed. He'd been prepared to guard a hysterical, pampered wife of a wealthy man, not this composed young woman who seemed more resigned than frightened. "I'll get a fire started," he said, unlocking the cabin door. "You must be cold." Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean, with a central room containing a table, chairs, and a stone fireplace. A curtained alcove in one corner presumably hid a bed. Xavier quickly set about building a fire while Bethany stood awkwardly by the door, taking in her surroundings. "Are you hungry?" he asked once the fire was crackling steadily. "There should be some dried meat and beans in the cupboard." "Who lives here?" she asked instead of answering. "Is this your home?" Xavier hesitated. "It belongs to all of us. We use it when we need to lie low for a while." "So you're outlaws," she said flatly. "Robbers." "It's not that simple," he replied, reaching for a pot to heat water. "Wilcox and men like him are the real thieves. They use the law to steal what doesn't belong to them. We just balance the scales a bit." Bethany moved closer to the fire, drawn by its warmth. "And that justifies violence. Those men with the coach, are they dead?" Xavier met her gaze directly. "The guard fired first." "We defend ourselves, but we don't kill unless we have to. Your driver ran off, and the guard who was shot will live." She seemed to consider this. "What will happen to me now?" "I don't know yet," he admitted. "That depends on what happens with Wilcox and on you." "On me?" "On whether you're a victim in all this or a willing participant in his schemes." Xavier began preparing a simple meal, more to give his hands something to do than from hunger. "Were you a willing participant?" Bethany laughed bitterly. "I was forced to marry him yesterday under threat from my own father. Before that, I'd spoken to him perhaps 3 times in my life. So no, Mr. I don't even know your name, Reeves. Xavier Reeves." The name slipped out before he could stop himself. Giving his real name was foolish, dangerous. "Well, Mr. Reeves, I am not a willing participant in anything Harold Wilcox has done, but that doesn't mean I approve of outlaws and robbery either." "Fair enough." He gestured to the table. "Sit. You should eat something." The meal was simple beans, jerky softened in the hot water, and hard biscuits, but Bethany ate with surprising appetite. Xavier watched her surreptitiously, noting the graceful way she held herself even in borrowed clothes, eating rough food in an outlaw's cabin. "How did you come to be riding with Caleb and his gang?" she asked suddenly, setting down her spoon. Xavier considered his answer carefully. "That's a long story." I don't appear to be going anywhere, she pointed out. He smiled despite himself. Fair point. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. I owned a small silver mine outside Silver Creek. It was producing nothing spectacular, but enough to build a future on. Then Wilcox decided he wanted the whole mountain. One by one, he started acquiring the mines around mine. How? Bethany asked, though her expression suggested she already knew. Various ways. Some men he bought out fair enough. Others found themselves with sudden tax problems or claim disputes. A few had accidents. Xavier's voice hardened. My brother Tom and I refused to sell. One night, men came to our cabin. They said they were just delivering a message from Wilcox, a new offer. They shot Tom when he turned to get his pipe. Said it was self-defense, that he'd reached for a gun. Bethany's face paled. I'm sorry. The sheriff, who's on Wilcox's payroll, ruled it justified. I was arrested for threatening Wilcox afterward. By the time I got out of jail, my claim had been declared abandoned and reassigned to one of Wilcox's companies. Xavier's eyes were hard with memory. I met Caleb in a saloon a month later. He'd lost his farm to Wilcox's bank. We found others with similar stories. Eventually, we decided to take back what was stolen from us. Bethany was silent for a long moment. If what you say is true, Wilcox is a monster, but that doesn't make what you're doing right. Maybe not, Xavier admitted. But sometimes the law doesn't serve justice. Sometimes you have to make your own. Before Bethany could respond, the sound of horses approached the cabin. Xavier stood quickly, drawing his revolver. Stay here, he ordered, moving to the window. Relief crossed his features as he recognized the riders. It's Caleb and the others, he told Bethany, though he didn't holster his weapon. 4 men dismounted outside, their expressions grim. Xavier opened the door to admit them, positioning himself between them and Bethany. How did it go? He asked Caleb. The scarred man removed his hat, running a hand through graying hair. Wilcox is alive, if that's what you're asking. He's being held at the camp. He glanced at Bethany. The miners want a proper trial before they decide what to do with him. A trial, Bethany stood. What kind of trial can outlaws give? Caleb's eyes narrowed. The kind where witnesses testify to what he's done and he gets a chance to defend himself, more than he ever gave any of us. He turned back to Xavier. We need to talk, privately. Xavier nodded, then looked at Bethany. Stay here. Please. The men stepped outside, closing the door behind them. Bethany immediately moved to the window, straining to hear their conversation, but they had walked too far away. She could see them gesturing, Caleb's face serious, Xavier shaking his head repeatedly. Something was being decided about her fate, and she was powerless to influence it. After what felt like an eternity, the men shook hands. Caleb and the others mounted their horses and rode away, while Xavier returned to the cabin, his expression unreadable. What's happening? Bethany demanded as soon as he entered. What are they going to do with Wilcox? With me? Xavier hung his hat on a peg by the door, buying time to frame his answer. Wilcox will be tried in 3 days at the miners' camp. If he's found guilty, he'll be punished, probably made to sign over his holdings and leave the territory. And if he refuses, Xavier's silence was answer enough. What about me? Bethany pressed. Caleb wanted to keep you at the camp until after the trial, he said finally. But I convinced him to let you stay here with me. Why? She asked, genuinely confused. Why would you do that? Xavier met her eyes directly. Because I don't think you deserve to be punished for Wilcox's crimes, and because... He hesitated. I think you've had enough choices taken away from you. Bethany studied him, trying to reconcile this thoughtful man with the outlaw who had helped ambush her wedding journey. What happens after the trial? That depends, Xavier said quietly, on what you want. What I want. The concept seemed foreign after months of having her life dictated by her father and then Wilcox. "Yes," Xavier said simply. "You'll choose your life from now on." The words hung between them, a promise and a challenge. For the first time since her father had pressed a gun to her head and demanded she marry Wilcox, Bethany felt a flicker of hope. "Get some rest," Xavier said gently. "You can take the bed behind the curtain. I'll sleep by the fire." Bethany hesitated, then nodded. As she moved toward the curtained alcove, she paused. "Thank you, Mr. Reeves." "Xavier," he corrected softly. "Just Xavier." "Thank you, Xavier," she said, and disappeared behind the curtain. Xavier stared at the fire long into the night, wondering what he'd gotten himself into and why. When he closed his eyes, all he could see was Bethany's face. Morning came with pale light filtering through the cabin's single window. Bethany woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was. The events of the previous day crashed back the coach attack, Wilcox being taken away, riding with Xavier to this hidden cabin. Xavier. She pushed aside the curtain cautiously, expecting to find him still asleep by the fire, but the main room was empty. A pot of coffee simmered on the small iron stove, filling the cabin with its rich aroma. Through the window, she could see Xavier chopping wood in the clearing, his shirt sleeves rolled up despite the morning chill. She watched him for a moment, struck by the fluid strength in his movements. He was nothing like Wilcox or any of the men her father had associated with men who measured their worth by money and status. Xavier Reeves seemed utterly self-contained, comfortable in his own skin in a way she found both fascinating and intimidating. Bethany poured herself a cup of coffee and stepped outside, wrapping her borrowed shirt more tightly around herself against the cool mountain air. Xavier paused mid-swing when he noticed her, lowering the axe. "Morning," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Sleep all right?" "Better than I expected," she admitted. "Thank you for the coffee." He nodded, setting another log on the chopping block. "I thought we might ride to the stream later. You could wash up there if you'd like." The idea of clean water was immensely appealing. Bethany nodded gratefully. "I'd like that very much." "There's bread and honey inside for breakfast," he said, returning to his chopping. "Help yourself." Bethany watched him for another moment before returning to the cabin. The simple domesticity of the scene: coffee brewing, bread waiting, Xavier working outside created an illusion of normalcy that was strangely comforting after the chaos of recent days. After breakfast, Xavier saddled his horse while Bethany gathered a few supplies soap Xavier had found in a cupboard, a clean shirt to change into, and a blanket to use as a towel. "The stream's about a mile west," Xavier explained as he helped her mount. "The water's cold but clean." He swung up behind her, and they rode in silence, though it was more comfortable than the tense quiet of the previous day. The forest around them was alive with morning sounds: birds calling, small animals rustling in the underbrush, the occasional distant bugle of an elk. The stream, when they reached it, was everything Xavier had promised: cold, clear water tumbling over smooth stones in a small, secluded valley. A stand of aspens provided privacy from the trail. "I'll wait over there," Xavier said, pointing to a ridge about 50 yards away. "Take your time. Call if you need anything." Bethany nodded, grateful for his consideration. When he was out of sight, she carefully removed the borrowed clothes and stepped into the stream, gasping at the cold. Quickly, she washed away the dirt and sweat of the past 2 days, scrubbing her hair and skin until they felt clean again. As she dressed in the fresh shirt and her now dry trousers, Bethany felt renewed. The physical cleansing seemed to clear her mind as well, allowing her to truly consider her situation for the first time. If what Xavier said about Wilcox was true and deep down, She believed it was then she had narrowly escaped a life with a violent, corrupt man. But what would happen to her now? She couldn't return to her parents. Her father had made it clear she was no longer welcome unless she was Mrs. Wilcox. She had no money, no skills that would earn her a living in a frontier town. Xavier was waiting where he'd promised, sitting with his back against a tree, hat pulled low over his eyes. He looked up as she approached, and something flickered across his face, appreciation, perhaps, quickly masked by polite restraint. "Better?" he asked, standing. "Much," she replied, suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. Her hair hung in damp waves down her back, and the shirt, though too large, was cleaner and less torn than the one she'd worn before. They rode back to the cabin in companionable silence. Xavier seemed lost in thought, and Bethany was content to watch the wilderness around them, so different from the rolling plains of her home. "How long have you lived in these mountains?" she asked as the cabin came into view. "Since I lost the mine," he replied. "About a year now. Before that, I was working claims since I was 18. No family," his jaw tightened, "just Tom. Our parents died of fever when I was 16. Tom raised me, taught me mining." He paused. "What about you? Any siblings?" Bethany shook her head. "Just my parents. My father was a rancher once, but gambling took most of our land. My mother keeps what's left running while She trailed off, while he creates more debts," Xavier finished for her. "Yes," she sighed. "I used to dream of leaving, making my own way. But there aren't many options for women out here." "What would you do?" Xavier asked, sounding genuinely curious. "If you could choose anything," Bethany considered the question. No one had ever asked her that before. "I'd like to teach," she said finally. "I was always good with numbers and letters. Or maybe run a store. Something useful, where I could be my own person." Xavier nodded thoughtfully as they reached the cabin. He helped her down from the horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes met briefly, and Bethany felt a strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. The moment was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Xavier tensed immediately, his hand moving to his revolver. "Get inside," he ordered, his voice suddenly hard. "Stay away from the windows." Bethany hurried into the cabin, heart racing. Through a crack in the shutters, she watched as a lone rider approached. To her surprise, Xavier relaxed, holstering his weapon as the rider came into clear view. It was a woman middle-aged with steel gray hair braided down her back, riding astride a sturdy mountain pony. She wore men's clothes and had a shotgun strapped to her saddle. "Martha," Xavier called in greeting. "Wasn't expecting you." The woman dismounted with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime on horseback. "Caleb sent me," she said, her voice gravelly but not unkind. "Thought your guest might need some proper clothes and female company." Her sharp eyes moved to the cabin. "She inside?" Xavier nodded, and the woman strode past him toward the door. Bethany backed away as it opened, unsure what to expect. Martha stopped in the doorway, assessing Bethany with a frank gaze. "Well, you're not what I pictured," she said finally. "Caleb said Wilcox's wife was with you, Xavier. I expected some painted city lady, not a girl wearing your clothes." "Mrs. Wilcox, Bethany lost her belongings in the coach accident," Xavier explained, following Martha inside. "It's just Bethany, please," Bethany said, finding her voice. "Mrs. Wilcox never felt right even before all this." Martha's weathered face softened slightly. "I'm Martha Raid. My husband Jim and I lost our ranch to Wilcox 3 years ago. We've been with Caleb's group since." She unslung a bundle from her shoulder. "Brought you some clothes that might fit better than Xavier's cast-offs." "Thank you," Bethany said, genuinely touched by the unexpected kindness. Martha nodded, then turned to Xavier. "Caleb wants an update, says you should come to the camp tomorrow. The trial's been moved up. Wilcox has people looking for him already. Xavier frowned. I can't leave Bethany alone. She'll come with me, Martha stated matter-of-factly. My cabin's smaller than this one, but it's clean and no one will bother her there. Is that what you want? Xavier asked Bethany, surprising both women with his deference to her preference. Bethany hesitated. Despite everything, she felt safer with Xavier than with this stranger, but she also recognized the logic of the arrangement. Will I see Wilcox at this camp? Not if you don't want to, Martha assured her. My place is on the opposite side from where they're holding him. After a moment's consideration, Bethany nodded. All right. Xavier looked like he wanted to object but held his tongue. I'll saddle the horses, he said instead, and stepped outside. Martha waited until he was gone before speaking again. He's a good man, Xavier Reeves, one of the best I know. He's an outlaw, Bethany pointed out quietly. So am I, according to the law, Martha replied without apology. Sometimes good people do things the law calls wrong because the law itself has failed them. She studied Bethany closely. Xavier says you were forced to marry Wilcox. That true? Yes. Then you understand better than most that what's legal isn't always what's right. Martha handed Bethany the bundle of clothes. Get changed. We should leave soon if we want to reach my place before dark. The clothes Martha had brought, a simple skirt, blouse, and woolen shawl, fit Bethany reasonably well, though the skirt was slightly short. Still, it felt good to be dressed as a woman again, even in such plain garments. When she emerged from behind the curtain, Xavier had returned. Something flickered in his eyes as he took in her appearance, but he quickly masked it. Ready? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. Bethany nodded, suddenly reluctant to leave the cabin that had been her sanctuary, however briefly. What will happen at this trial? She asked. Xavier and Martha exchanged glances. Justice, if we have anything to say about it, Martha answered. Wilcox will face those he's wronged. He'll hear their stories. If he shows remorse, makes restitution, he might walk away. And if not, neither answered directly. Xavier finally said, Let's hope it doesn't come to that. The ride to Martha's cabin took several hours, winding deeper into the mountains along trails that barely deserved the name. Bethany rode behind Xavier until they reached a fork in the path, where Martha indicated they would part ways. I'll see you tomorrow at the camp, Xavier told Bethany, helping her down from his horse. His hands lingered at her waist again, and this time she was certain the contact wasn't accidental. Be careful, she said, surprising herself with the genuine concern in her voice. A half-smile touched his lips. Always am. Martha's cabin was indeed smaller than the one she'd shared with Xavier, but as promised, it was clean and comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and simple furniture, a table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed filled the single room. It's not much, Martha said, lighting a lamp as dusk fell, but it's home now. It's lovely, Bethany said honestly. Thank you for your hospitality. Martha waved off her thanks. Any enemy of Wilcox is a friend of mine. She began preparing a simple supper of salt pork and beans. You must have questions. Many, Bethany admitted, taking a seat at the table, but I'm not sure where to begin. Start with what's bothering you most, Martha suggested practically. Bethany considered this. If Wilcox is found guilty at this trial, what will happen to me? Martha stirred the beans thoughtfully. That depends on what you want, I suppose. No one here holds you responsible for Wilcox's crimes. If the marriage is dissolved, and it likely will be, one way or another you'll be free to go wherever you choose. I have nowhere to go, Bethany said softly. My father made it clear I wasn't welcome back unless I was Mrs. Wilcox. Then you'll make a new start, Martha said firmly. There are decent towns where a young woman with education could find work teaching or clerking. Denver, maybe, Or you could stay in these mountains. We look after our own." "I'm not one of you," Bethany pointed out. Martha gave her a shrewd look. "Xavier seems to think you could be." Bethany felt heat rise to her cheeks. "He hardly knows me." "He knows enough," Martha said cryptically, turning back to the cooking pot. "Eat something, then rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." They ate in companionable silence, and afterward, Martha insisted Bethany take the bed while she slept in a chair by the fire. Despite her protests, Bethany was grateful her body still ached from the coach crash and the long rides. As she drifted towards sleep, Bethany found herself thinking not of Wilcox or the uncertain future, but of Xavier Reeves, his quiet strength, his unexpected kindness, and the way his eyes seemed to see through all her carefully constructed defenses. Morning brought clear skies and a sense of foreboding. Bethany dressed in the clothes Martha had provided, braiding her hair in a simple style that kept it off her face. Martha, already up and preparing breakfast, nodded approvingly. "You look more yourself today," she commented, passing Bethany a plate of cornbread and dried apple slices. "Eat up. We ride for the camp in an hour." Will Xavier be there?" Bethany asked, trying to sound casual. Martha's knowing smile suggested she hadn't succeeded. "He'll be there. Probably pacing a hole in the ground waiting for us, if I know him." They rode out as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, Martha leading the way on her sturdy pony, while Bethany followed on a gentle mare borrowed from a neighbor. The trail climbed steadily, winding through pine forests and across small meadows bright with wildflowers. "It's beautiful here," Bethany said, breaking a long silence. "So different from the plains where I grew up." "These mountains get in your blood," Martha agreed. "Jim and I thought we'd die when Wilcox took our ranch, but we found a different kind of freedom up here." "Is that what all of you have? Freedom?" Martha considered this. "Of a sort. Freedom from men like Wilcox who use the law to steal what they want. Freedom to live by our own code." She glanced back at Bethany. "It's not perfect. We're still outlaws to the world below. But up here, we've built something that works for us." The camp, when they finally reached it shortly before noon, was larger than Bethany had expected. A dozen cabins and twice as many tents clustered around a central clearing where a large fire pit dominated. Men, women, and even a few children moved about, carrying water, chopping wood, tending gardens carved into the mountainside. Their arrival drew curious stares. Bethany kept her head high, though she felt a flutter of anxiety as people stopped their work to watch her pass. "Wilcox's wife," she heard someone mutter. "Poor girl," another voice replied. "Heard he bought her from her father." Martha led her to a cabin at the edge of the clearing, larger than the others and built of squared timber rather than rough logs. "The meeting hall," she explained. "The trial will be held here." As they dismounted, Xavier emerged from the hall, his face lighting when he saw Bethany. He crossed to them quickly, offering a hand to help her down, though she'd already dismounted. "You're here," he said, relief evident in his voice. "How was your night?" "Quiet," she replied, unreasonably pleased by his concern. "Martha was very kind." Martha snorted. "Kindness had nothing to do with it. We take care of our own." She looked between them with shrewd eyes. "I'll leave you two to talk. The trial starts in an hour." She took the reins of both horses and led them toward a small corral. Alone with Xavier, Bethany suddenly felt awkward, unsure what to say or how to act. He seemed similarly uncertain, shifting his weight from one foot to another. "How are you really?" he asked finally. "Confused," she admitted. "Afraid, but also relieved in a strange way." She met his eyes directly. "Is that terrible, to feel relief that my husband might be punished? After what he did to you, what he's done to others?" "No, it's not terrible." Xavier hesitated, then offered his arm. "Would you like to walk? There's something I want to show you before the trial begins. Bethany took his arm, acutely aware of the solid strength beneath her fingers. They walked away from the camp, following a narrow trail that led to a rocky outcropping overlooking the valley below. "This is my favorite place in the whole mountain," Xavier said as they reached the viewpoint. "You can see for miles." The vista was breathtaking, rugged mountains stretching to the horizon, valleys cloaked in pine forests, a distant river glinting like silver thread in the sunlight. Far below, barely visible, lay a small town that must be Silver Creek. "It's magnificent," Bethany breathed. "I come here to think," Xavier said, standing close beside her. "To remember why we're fighting. All those people down there, the shopkeepers, the farmers, the miners, they're just trying to live their lives. But men like Wilcox see them only as means to more wealth, more power." He turned to face her, his expression earnest. "I didn't plan to become an outlaw, Bethany. I wanted a simple life, mine, maybe a wife and children someday, a future built with my own hands." His jaw tightened. "Wilcox took that from me when he had my brother killed. I can never get that back." Bethany felt the weight of his loss, saw the pain still fresh in his eyes. Impulsively, she reached out to touch his cheek. "I'm sorry, Xavier. Truly." He covered her hand with his own, holding it against his face for a moment before gently lowering it. But he didn't release it, instead lacing his fingers through hers. "Whatever happens today," he said quietly, "I want you to know that you have choices, real choices, not just what Wilcox or your father or even I might want for you." The sincerity in his voice made her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered. They stood in silence for a long moment, hands still joined, looking out over the vast wilderness. Finally, Xavier sighed. "We should get back. The trial will be starting soon." The meeting hall was packed when they returned, with nearly every member of the camp present. A long table had been placed at the front, where Caleb and 3 others, 2 men and a woman, sat facing the room. A single chair stood before them, currently empty. Xavier led Bethany to a seat near the back, where they would be less conspicuous. "The council," he explained quietly, nodding toward the table. "They'll hear the evidence and decide Wilcox's fate. Caleb is the leader, but each decision must be unanimous." Before Bethany could respond, the door opened, and a murmur ran through the crowd. Harold Wilcox was led in, his hands bound before him, flanked by 2 armed men. He looked disheveled but unharmed, his expensive suit dirty and wrinkled, his silver hair in disarray. His eyes swept the room and fixed on Bethany with a glare of such hatred that she instinctively shrank back. Xavier moved closer, his shoulder pressing protectively against hers. "Don't let him intimidate you," he murmured. "He can't hurt you here." Caleb stood, and the room fell silent. "Harold Wilcox," he began, his voice carrying easily through the hall, "you stand accused of multiple crimes against the people of Silver Creek and the surrounding territory. Theft through fraudulent business practices, corruption of law officials, and murder, both by your own hand and through hired guns." Wilcox straightened in his chair, somehow managing to look imperious despite his bonds. "I don't recognize your authority to try me," he spat. "This is kidnapping and unlawful detention. When the real law finds you, the real law, as you call it, has failed these people repeatedly." Caleb cut him off. "Every man and woman here sought justice through legal channels first. Only when that failed did they turn to us." He gestured around the room. "Today, you will hear their stories. Then you will have a chance to defend yourself." For the next 2 hours, person after person came forward to testify. A grizzled miner described how Wilcox's men had salted his claim with fool's gold, then called in experts who declared the mine worthless, forcing him to sell for a fraction of its value. A young widow told how her husband had confronted Wilcox about wage theft at his sawmill and was found hanging from a tree the next day. His death ruled a suicide despite suspicious circumstances. A former banker admitted to falsifying documents at Wilcox's behest, foreclosing on farms and businesses that were actually current on their payments. Through it all, Wilcox sat stone-faced, occasionally snorting in derision or muttering under his breath. His eyes frequently found Bethany, his gaze alternating between threatening and calculating. Finally, Caleb turned to him. "You've heard the charges against you. What is your defense?" Wilcox stood slowly, surveying the room with contempt. "My defense is that business is business. If these people weren't smart enough or strong enough to protect what was theirs, they deserved to lose it." His lip curled. "The West isn't for the weak. I built something from nothing while these failures blame me for their own inadequacies." A murmur of anger rippled through the crowd. Caleb raised a hand for silence. "Is that all you have to say?" he asked, Wilcox's gaze fixed on Bethany again. "I would speak to my wife, privately." "Absolutely not," Xavier said immediately, half rising from his seat. Caleb looked to Bethany. "Mrs. Wilcox, the choice is yours." Every eye in the room turned to her. Bethany felt the weight of their attention, but more than that, she felt the opportunity to make a real choice, perhaps the first in her life. "I will speak with him," she said firmly, ignoring Xavier's protest. "But not privately. Here, before everyone." Caleb nodded approvingly. "Approach the council table, both of you." Xavier caught her arm as she stood. "Bethany, you don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," she said quietly. "For myself." She walked to the front of the room, conscious of Xavier's worried gaze following her. Wilcox was brought to stand a few feet away from her, his hands still bound. "You wanted to speak to me," she said, proud that her voice didn't tremble. Wilcox leaned closer, lowering his voice, though in the silent room everyone could still hear him. "You can end this farce, Bethany. Tell them you want to return to town with me. As my wife, you have that right." "Why would I do that?" she asked, genuinely curious. His expression hardened. "Because if you don't, you'll have nothing. No home, no money, no future. What will you do? Become a whore in some mining camp? Or perhaps you've already decided to spread your legs for that outlaw who's been protecting you." Gasps and angry murmurs erupted from the crowd. Xavier started forward, fury on his face, but Bethany held up a hand to stop him. "Mr. Wilcox," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the hall, "for 2 days I have listened to stories about you. About your greed, your cruelty, your complete disregard for human life. I believed them all because in the brief time I knew you before our marriage, I saw the same callousness." She straightened her spine, meeting his glare without flinching. "But I didn't truly understand the depth of your depravity until this moment. You think that threatening me with poverty or insulting my virtue will make me choose you. It only confirms what kind of man you really are." She turned to Caleb. "I want a divorce, or whatever passes for one in these mountains. I was forced into this marriage against my will, and I want no part of it or him ever again." Applause broke out among the spectators. Wilcox's face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful little—" He lunged toward her, but the guards caught him before he could reach her. "I think we've heard enough," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the commotion. "The council will deliberate. Everyone else, clear the hall." Xavier was at Bethany's side immediately, leading her outside with a protective arm around her shoulders. She was trembling now, the full impact of what she'd done hitting her all at once. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," Xavier murmured, guiding her to a quiet spot beneath a pine tree at the edge of the clearing. "Are you all right?" "I think so," she said, taking deep breaths to steady herself. I've spent my whole life doing what I was told by my father, by society, by men who thought they owned me. It felt good to finally speak my mind. Xavier smiled, a genuine, warm expression that transformed his face. "You're remarkable, Bethany Davis." "Not Wilcox?" she asked with a small smile of her own. "Never Wilcox," he said firmly. "That name doesn't deserve to be attached to someone like you." They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching as the camp continued its normal activities, despite the drama unfolding in the meeting hall. Children played a game of tag between the cabins. Women hung laundry on lines stretched between trees. Men repaired tools and tended gardens. "It's like a normal town," Bethany observed, "just hidden away." "That's exactly what it is," Xavier replied. "A community of people who couldn't find justice in the world below, so they created their own world up here. Is there a place for someone like me in that world?" She asked softly, not looking at him. Before he could answer, a shout went up from the direction of the meeting hall. The council members had emerged and were summoning everyone back. "They've reached a decision," Xavier said, standing and offering his hand to help Bethany up. That was quick. They joined the crowd filing back into the hall. Wilcox stood before the council table again, his expression a mixture of defiance and fear. Caleb raised his hands for silence. "We've heard the testimony against Harold Wilcox. We've heard his own words in his defense. And we've deliberated on a just punishment." He looked directly at Wilcox. "By unanimous decision of this council, you are found guilty of theft, corruption, and murder." A hush fell over the room. Bethany felt Xavier tense beside her. "The usual penalty for such crimes is death," Caleb continued, and Wilcox visibly blanched. "However, we are not executioners. Instead, your punishment is this. You will sign over all property and business interests acquired through fraudulent means to a trust that will redistribute them to their rightful owners. You will then leave Colorado territory and never return. If you are seen within 100 miles of Silver Creek after tomorrow, your life is forfeit." Murmurs of surprise and approval rippled through the crowd. Wilcox sputtered in outrage. "You can't do this. You have no legal authority." "Your choice is simple," Caleb said coldly. "Sign the papers we've prepared or face the alternative punishment. Decide now." For a tense moment, Wilcox stood rigid with fury. Then, shoulders slumping in defeat, he nodded. "I'll sign." "A wise decision," Caleb said. "The documents will be brought to you. Once signed and witnessed, you'll be escorted to the territorial border." He turned to the assembled crowd. "Justice has been served. This trial is concluded." As people began to file out, discussing the outcome in excited voices, Xavier turned to Bethany. "It's over," he said softly. "You're free." Free. The word echoed in Bethany's mind, exhilarating and terrifying at once. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Xavier said, taking her hand, "you decide what you want your life to be." They stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight. The camp was buzzing with excitement, people gathering in small groups to discuss the trial's outcome. Caleb spotted them and made his way over. "Mrs. Davis," he said, deliberately using her maiden name, "on behalf of the council, I want to express our admiration for your courage today." "Thank you," Bethany replied, "but I only spoke the truth." Caleb nodded appreciatively. "Truth is rare enough to be valuable." He turned to Xavier. "A word." They stepped aside, speaking in low voices that Bethany couldn't quite catch. She watched their animated conversation, noticing how others in the camp regarded Xavier with obvious respect. He was more than just a member of their community, he was a leader in his own right. When they returned, Caleb extended his hand to Bethany. "You're welcome to stay in our community for as long as you wish. We protect our own." After he left, Xavier seemed oddly hesitant. "There's something I'd like to show you," he said finally, "if you're willing to ride a bit farther today." Curious, Bethany agreed. They collected fresh horses from the corral and set out, following a different trail than the one that had brought them to the camp. This path descended gently, winding through forests of aspen whose leaves trembled in the afternoon breeze. "Where are we going?" Bethany asked after they'd ridden for nearly an hour. "You'll see," Xavier replied with an enigmatic smile. "Just a little farther." The trail opened suddenly onto a small valley nestled between protective ridges. A clear stream meandered through meadows dotted with wildflowers. And there, on a gentle rise overlooking the valley, stood a half-built cabin log stacked to form walls, but no roof yet in place. Xavier reined his horse to a stop, watching Bethany's face as she took in the scene. "What is this place?" she asked, enchanted by the peaceful beauty of the valley. "Mine," he said simply, "or it will be when I finish building." He dismounted and helped her down from her horse. "Come see." He led her to the cabin site where tools lay neatly organized beside stacks of prepared logs. "I started it last spring," he explained. "Been working on it whenever I can get away from other activities." "It's lovely," Bethany said honestly, running her hand along the smooth, planed logs. "But why show me?" Xavier took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "Because I wanted you to see that I have plans beyond being an outlaw. That there's a future I'm building, even if it's taking time." He met her eyes directly. "And because I hoped, you might want to be part of that future." Bethany stared at him, stunned by the implication of his words. "Xavier, we barely know each other." "I know," he admitted with a self-deprecating smile. "And I'm not proposing marriage, not now, not after what you've been through. That would be the last thing you need." He took her hands in his. "But I am asking if you might stay. Not at the camp, but with Martha or one of the other families while we get to know each other properly." "Why?" she asked, needing to understand. "Because from the moment I pulled you from that overturned coach, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you," he said simply. "Your courage, your kindness, your strength. I've never met anyone like you, Bethany Davis." The honesty in his eyes took her breath away. After a lifetime of manipulation and lies from the men in her life, Xavier's straightforward declaration was like a drink of clear water. "I don't know what I want yet," she said carefully. "I've never had the chance to decide for myself before." "Then take time to decide," he said, squeezing her hands gently. "That's all I'm asking. A chance to show you what life could be like if you choose to stay." Bethany looked around the valley, imagining the cabin completed, smoke rising from a stone chimney, perhaps a garden beside it, horses grazing in the meadow. It was a vision of a life she'd never allowed herself to dream of, simple but rich with possibility, built on freedom and choice rather than obligation. "I'll stay," she said finally. "For a while at least, to see what might grow between us." The smile that lit Xavier's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Without thinking, Bethany leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a brief, sweet kiss that held the promise of more to come. When she pulled back, Xavier looked dazed but delighted. "I should show you half-built cabins more often," he murmured. She laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Perhaps you should." They spent the afternoon exploring the valley, with Xavier pointing out his plans where he would build a barn, where the best soil was for a garden, how he intended to divert part of the stream for irrigation. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Bethany found herself offering suggestions, imagining herself as part of this dream. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, Xavier reluctantly suggested they return to the camp. "Martha will worry if we're not back by dark," he explained. They rode in comfortable silence, Bethany's mind filled with new possibilities. She had no idea what the future might hold, but for the first time in her life, that uncertainty felt exciting rather than frightening. 3 months later, Bethany stood on the porch of Martha Reed's cabin, watching early snow dust the mountains with white. The camp had changed with the season's gardens harvested and preserved for winter, cabins reinforced against the coming cold, hunting parties bringing in game to smoke and salt. She had changed too. Her hands, once soft from a life of relative ease, now bore calluses from helping with camp chores. Her skin was tanned from days spent outdoors. And her heart had opened in ways she'd never thought possible. Xavier's cabin in the valley was nearly complete. They had worked on it together through the late summer and fall, Bethany learning to notch logs, lay floorboards, and chink walls with a mixture of mud and straw. The roof was on, the chimney built, windows installed with real glass that Xavier had carefully transported from Denver. Soon it would be ready for winter. Their relationship had grown as steadily as the cabin, built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Xavier had been true to his word, giving Bethany space to discover herself even as they grew closer. They had shared long conversations, laughter, occasional arguments, and increasingly passionate embraces, but Xavier had never pressed for more. "Daydreaming again?" Martha asked, joining Bethany on the porch with 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Just thinking," Bethany replied, accepting the cup gratefully. "About how much has changed since I came here." Martha's weathered face creased in a smile. "You've bloomed like a flower that finally got enough sun, that's what. It suits you. I never imagined I could be this." "Content," Bethany admitted, "even with all the hardships of living up here." "Have you decided what you'll do when winter sets in properly?" Martha asked. "Xavier's been mighty patient, but that man's eyes follow you like a lost pup whenever you're in the same room." Bethany felt her cheeks warm despite the cold air. "I've been thinking about that too." Before she could elaborate, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. A small party was riding into Camp, Xavier among them, returning from a trip to Denver. Bethany's heart quickened at the sight of him, tall and straight in the saddle, his face breaking into a smile when he spotted her. "Speak of the devil," Martha murmured with a knowing look. "I'll leave you two to talk." She retreated into the cabin, closing the door pointedly behind her. Xavier dismounted and handed his reins to another rider, then strode directly to the porch. His face was wind-burned from the journey, his eyes bright with something that looked like anticipation. "You're back early," Bethany said, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow." "Couldn't stay away," he replied simply, taking her hands in his. "I have something to show you." Curious, she followed him to his horse, where he retrieved a bundle from his saddlebags. "Let's go inside where it's warm," he suggested. In Martha's cabin, by the light of the fireplace, Xavier unwrapped the bundle to reveal several official-looking documents. "What are these?" Bethany asked, peering at the formal legal script. "This one," he said, laying out the first paper, "is the deed to my valley. Officially registered with the Territorial Land Office." She looked up in surprise. "How? I thought Caleb has connections in Denver," Xavier explained. "People sympathetic to our cause." When Wilcox signed over his holdings, some of the money was used to legally secure land for those of us who lost everything to him. His expression turned serious. "I wanted to be sure that when I offered you a home, it would be one that no one could take away." Bethany's throat tightened with emotion. "And this?" she asked, indicating the second document. "This certifies that your marriage to Harold Wilcox has been legally dissolved on grounds of coercion," Xavier said quietly. "It wasn't easy to arrange, but Caleb's lawyer friend made it happen." "You're officially free, Bethany. Tears welled in her eyes. "Xavier, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything yet," he assured her quickly. "I promised you time to decide what you want, and that promise still stands. But I wanted you to know that when you do decide, there are no legal entanglements holding you back." Bethany looked at the documents again, then back at Xavier's earnest face. In that moment, she knew with absolute certainty what she wanted. "Ask me," she said softly. Xavier's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" "More sure than I've ever been of anything," she replied. "Ask me, Xavier." Slowly, he knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Bethany Davis, I've loved you since the moment you stood up to Wilcox at that trial, though I think my heart knew it even before then. Will you marry me, live with me in our valley, build a life with me?" "Yes," she said simply, joy bubbling through her like a mountain spring. "Yes, I will." Their wedding took place on Christmas Day in the meeting hall decorated with pine boughs and candles. The entire camp gathered to witness as Bethany, in a simple white dress made by Martha and the other women, pledged herself to Xavier. Not out of obligation or fear, but from love freely given and received. "You have chosen each other," Caleb said as he conducted the ceremony, "just as you have each chosen the path that brought you here. May your life together be built on that same freedom of choice, and may you choose each other anew each day." When Xavier kissed her as his wife, Bethany felt the last shadows of her past life melt away. This was her beginning, her true beginning, and she faced it with hope and determination. They moved into the finished cabin in the valley the following week. On their first night there, with snow falling gently outside and a fire crackling in the hearth they had built together, Xavier drew Bethany into his arms. "Happy?" he asked, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Completely," she replied, resting her head against his chest. "I never imagined I could feel this way." "This is just the beginning," he promised. "Every day a new choice, every day a new adventure. Together," she murmured, lifting her face for his kiss. "Always together," he agreed. Spring came to the valley with a riot of wildflowers and the music of the swollen stream. Bethany planted her garden while Xavier finished the small barn. They acquired chickens, 2 milk cows, and a pair of workhorses. Life settled into a rhythm of shared work and shared joy. News came occasionally from the world below. Harold Wilcox had reportedly resurfaced in San Francisco, trying to rebuild his fortune, but finding his reputation had preceded him. Bethany's parents had sold what remained of their ranch and moved east to live with distant relatives. The sheriff of Silver Creek, deprived of Wilcox's patronage, had been replaced in a special election by a former miner who promised fair enforcement of the law. Slowly, some members of the mountain community began to consider returning to their former lives. With Wilcox gone and properties being restored to rightful owners, the need for their particular brand of justice was diminishing. Caleb spoke of perhaps moving the entire camp down to Silver Creek come summer to reintegrate with the society they had left behind. "Would you want to go back?" Xavier asked Bethany one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson. If Caleb's right and it's safe now, she considered the question seriously. "There are things I miss," she admitted. "Books, music. Sometimes even just the bustle of town on market day." She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "But this is our home. We built it together. I can't imagine leaving it." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "We could visit sometimes. It's only a day's ride to Silver Creek." "But I agree this valley is where we belong." Bethany smiled, taking his hand and placing it gently on her stomach. "Especially now that our family is growing." Xavier froze, then turned to her with wonder dawning on his face. "Are you saying?" "Yes," she confirmed, laughing at his expression. "Come November, there will be 3 of us in this cabin." His whoop of joy echoed across the valley, startling a nearby deer into flight. Xavier lifted Bethany in his arms, spinning her around before carefully setting her down again, suddenly concerned. "Should you be up and about? Do you need to rest? I'll build you a more comfortable chair and—" "Xavier," she interrupted, still laughing, "I'm with child, not made of glass. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." He had the grace to look sheepish. "I just want to take care of you both." "And you will," she assured him, cupping his cheek. "But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We have months yet to prepare." As summer ripened into fall, Bethany's body changed with the seasons. Xavier watched over her with devoted attention, insisting on taking on more of the heavier chores despite her protests that she was perfectly capable. When she reached her 7th month, Martha moved temporarily into their spare room to help prepare for the birth and teach Bethany what to expect. "He's driving me to distraction," Bethany confided to Martha one afternoon as they preserved the last of the garden's harvest. "Yesterday he wouldn't let me walk to the stream alone, as if I might deliver the baby halfway there." Martha chuckled. "Men are useless at this part." "My Jim was the same way with both our children. Best thing is to give him tasks to keep him busy, have him build a cradle or something." Bethany smiled. "He's already built 2, plus a rocking chair and enough toys to last until the child is 5 years old." "Then he's better than most," Martha said approvingly. "The worry just means he cares." November brought early snow, and on a night when the full moon illuminated the white blanketed valley, Bethany's labor began. Xavier paced anxiously outside the bedroom door while Martha attended to Bethany inside, his face growing more concerned with each cry of pain. Finally, near dawn, a new sound filled the cabin, the lusty wail of a newborn taking its first breath. The bedroom door opened, and Martha appeared, her face tired but triumphant. "You have a son," she told Xavier. "Healthy as a horse and just as loud." Xavier entered the bedroom with reverent steps to find Bethany propped up on pillows, a small bundle cradled in her arms. Her face was exhausted but radiant with a joy he had never seen before. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Xavier sat carefully on the edge of the bed, peering at the tiny red face wrapped in a soft blanket. A shock of dark hair, still damp from birth, curled over the baby's forehead. As he watched, the infant's eyes opened unfocused, but somehow seeming to look directly at him. "He's perfect," Xavier whispered, gently touching the baby's cheek with one finger. The tiny hand that emerged from the blanket latched onto his finger with surprising strength. "What shall we call him?" They had discussed names but hadn't settled on any. Now, looking at the child's determined expression, Bethany knew. "Thomas," she said, "after your brother." Tears filled Xavier's eyes. "Thomas Davis Reeves," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "A good, strong name for a good, strong boy." "A name with history," Bethany agreed, "but his future will be his own to choose, just like ours." Xavier leaned over to kiss her, then pressed his lips gently to his son's forehead. "Thank you," he murmured, "for choosing me, for choosing us." "Best choice I ever made," Bethany replied, her eyes bright with happy tears. 5 years later, Bethany stood in the doorway of their expanded cabin, watching Xavier teach young Thomas how to saddle his pony. The boy, a miniature version of his father with his mother's determined chin, listened with serious attention to every instruction. Beside them, 2-year-old Alina, named for Xavier's mother, chased butterflies through the meadow grass, her blonde curls bouncing with each step. The valley had flourished under their care. The original cabin had been expanded to include 2 more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. A proper barn now sheltered their livestock. Fruit trees, still young but promising, formed an orchard behind the house. And most remarkably, they were no longer alone. 3 other families had built homes nearby, creating a small, close-knit community. Silver Creek had changed too. With Wilcox gone and his stolen assets redistributed, the town had grown into a prosperous but fair-minded community. Caleb served as mayor now, his outlaw past known but forgiven in light of his dedication to justice. Most of the former mountain camp residents had reintegrated into town life, though they maintained close ties with those who, like Xavier and Bethany, preferred their independence in the high country. "Mama, look," Thomas called excitedly as he mounted his pony with Xavier's help. "I'm doing it myself. I see you," Bethany called back, waving. "You're getting so big." Xavier secured the boy's stirrups, then looked up at Bethany with the same smile that still made her heart skip, part tenderness, part mischief, wholly hers. In his eyes, she could read the same thought that filled her own heart. This was the life they had chosen, built with their own hands from the ashes of what had been taken from them. As the winter sun cast long shadows across their valley, Bethany reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought her here. A forced marriage, a coach robbery, a mountain hideout, each seemingly tragic event had been a step on the path to this happiness. She had been a pawn in other people's games, but in the end, she had claimed the right to make her own choices, to build her own life, to find her own love, and in that freedom, she had found everything she'd never dared to dream of.